Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. Today is Friday, October 10th, 2025, and I was thinking that possibly a goldfish would be a better candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize than President Donald J. Trump, because since taking office, he has bombed several countries. He has basically sponsored a genocide in Gaza and in the West Bank by providing intelligence bombs um, and political cover um, for the Netanyahu regime in Gaza. He has bombed Somalia. He's bombed Iran. He has bombed people in fast boats in the Caribbean. And President Donald Trump became so totally deluded and obsessed about the Nobel Peace Prize that he kept on talking about it and thought that if he talked about it long enough that he would win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm sure he was working his influences to try to get that. So I was thinking, maybe a goldfish would be a better candidate, because at least a goldfish isn't dropping bombs and protecting genocide. But I was thinking in the wrong category. I was thinking about about a nice fish that gives peace, and they'll put fish in a dentist's office so that people will come in and they'll calm down before they get some drill that will drill into their tooth. And so these goldfish, they are great you know symbols of peace and tranquility, and people will come in and see the fish swimming around and everything. So I was totally in the wrong direction. I should have really thought about like a puppet theater, where you have somebody above with controlling a puppet with strings, or possibly a puppet on a hand, and the puppet comes up and says, "Oh, hello everyone, hello." And so I really should have been thinking about a puppet. And so I'm sorry, I was thinking about a goldfish. I don't know what came into me. But anyway, if we go back here to the idea of the puppet, the person who received the Nobel Peace Prize was the Venezuelan opposition. They call her opposition leader, just basically a U.S. puppet, Maria Corina Machado, who spent her years working for the freedom of the Venezuelan people. Well, Maria Corina Machado was working for a U.S. NGO, which, as you may know, the U.S. NGOs aren't there to bring peace, happiness, and food and goodwill to other countries. The NGOs are there to infiltrate the structure of other countries, and on behalf of the CIA, U.S. State Department, Pentagon, who knows. And so these NGOs are there basically as regime change or regime infiltration devices, part of the U.S. government. And this persona, Maria Corina Machado, I'm looking at a picture of her meeting President Bush in 2002. And she was then the director of Sumate, which is Everyone Together or something like that, an independent, in quotes, independent democratic civil society group funded by the U.S. government to oversee the electoral process in Venezuela. Well, basically, when the U.S. government starts supervising your elections, you know that you're in trouble. Because the next thing is that if they don't get the result that they want, they will say that they had observers on the ground and this was a fraud and there was ballot stuffing and all kinds of fraudulent actions against the process of democracy, and we must uphold the process of democracy. And if you want to think about the United States and how it supports the process of democracy in other countries, just think about the Green Zone in Iraq, which was this fictitious paradise of democracy in Baghdad. And so this Green Zone, basically, it was the U.S. perimeter controlled, and everything inside there was controlled. What came in, what went out. And so this zone was the democracy zone, the Green Zone. And this is where democracy was shining a bright light out to Iraq that had been, under the stern and arm of Saddam Hussein, and who didn't believe in democracy or anything like that. So anyway, we had the Green Zone, and then we had our wonderful, democratic elections in Afghanistan. So I believe the first election they had in Afghanistan, I don't know if it was the first one, but anyway, they had it right before winter. And this Karzai individual won the election, and many who had participated in the election had agreed that the election was fraught with corruption, ballot stuffing, and Karzai, basically the U.S. The person who was flexible and controllable by the U.S. government won the election. And so the problem with that election was that it took place right before the winter, and so many of the regions in Afghanistan are difficult to reach in the wintertime because the snow and ice cut off the roads that go up to the smaller communities. So anyway, the opposition said, well, we'll let it pass this time because, the danger to the population of trying to get to these ballot boxes is much worse than, trying to redo the election. So anyway, this was a corrupt election that the U.S. sponsored in Afghanistan and held it right before the winter, knowing that they wouldn't be able to have a redo on the election due to the corruption that was in that election. So anyway, we go back to this whole situation of Venezuela and how the United States has been pushing so hard to get democracy into Venezuela. So anyway, we know that this is totally a non-starter, because the United States, what it's always wanted from Venezuela is its oil. And it's interesting that the father of George W. Bush it was involved in the 1991 Gulf War, and he stated that the U.S. was going into we went into this war because Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and George Bush at the time, George Bush father said that Kuwait was a blossoming democracy. So if you take a look at Kuwait, it hasn't been a democracy. It isn't a democracy. It never will be a democracy. And I'm not saying that it has to be or should be, or I'm asking that one day it will be a democracy. I don't really care. The Gulf nations are all basically a type of monarchical structure, and this is the structure that works best for them, and that's cool. I have no problem. But to call a non-democracy a democracy, and then state that we're going into Iraq and we're gonna attack Saddam Hussein and get him to remove his troops from Kuwait to save the democracy that was blossoming, and was just one giant lie. And the U.S. population bought it for a while, and then a few of the networks challenged that narrative. Now we have, George Bush son, George W., and he meets this person, Corina Machado, and they put out this narrative that she was heading up this organization, Sumate, an independent democratic civil society group founded or funded by the U.S. government to oversee the electoral process in Venezuela. So this is, as you know, anywhere where you see that the U.S. is trying to push a democracy, it's because something is behind that. So in Iraq, the reason why we went after Saddam Hussein eventually in Iraq was because of the oil, and we wanted to control the oil. Of course, we also wanted to control the geopolitical situation in the region, but the oil was a big factor. And Venezuela is sitting on one of the largest deposits in the world. So Venezuela is a very oil-rich country, and they say, well, this is in heavy oil and nobody wants it. It takes too much to refine. Well, if it's oil, it's oil. And whether you have to refine it a little more or a little less, I don't think it really matters. But the United States is not interested in Venezuela because it has or doesn't have a democracy. But anyway, that is the narrative in so many people about it. Even the Nobel Peace Prize awarding committee. So anyway, if we move down this article, which I will put a link to in the description below this video, there is an article from the People's Dispatch, and it talks about Maria's achievements. So the first achievement, really important achievement of Maria, is she led a 2002 coup that briefly overthrew a democratically elected president and signed the Carmona Decree that erased the Constitution and dissolved every public institution overnight. So she made this first attempt at a coup and regime change in Venezuela in 2002. And so basically, if you know anything about politics, when you have a coup to throw out an elected government, that's usually not a democratic action. So anyway, let's move on to another achievement. She worked hand in hand with Washington to justify regime change, using her platform to demand foreign military intervention to liberate Venezuela through force. So another non-democratic action that she was pushing for. She cheered on Donald Trump's threats of invasion and his naval deployments in the Caribbean, a show of force that risks igniting regional war. So basically, she's just continuing along the regime change line. So still no more democracy. So we haven't seen any democratic effort on her behalf yet. So anyway, she pushed for the U.S. sanction that strangled the economy, knowing exactly who would pay the price: the poor, the sick, the working class. Okay. Another point that they mention here in this article, she helped construct the so-called interim government, a Washington-backed puppet show run by a self-appointed president who looted Venezuela's resources abroad while children at home went hungry. So another achievement which the People's Dispatch points out, she vows to reopen Venezuela's embassy in Jerusalem, aligning herself openly with the same apartheid state that bombs hospitals and calls it self-defense. Okay, and the last achievement which the People's Dispatch mentions, now she wants to hand over the country's oil, water, and infrastructure to private corporations. This is the same recipe that made Latin America the laboratory of neoliberal misery in the 90s. So basically, the reason why Chavez and Maduro came to power was due to the sacking of the country's resources, and the battle between who would get access to all these resources so that they could then sell them to foreign countries. And we had one coup after another in Venezuela, and then when Chavez came in, he brought stability. Maduro has continued that stability. Whether it is a 100% democracy, I can't say, but there has obviously been an effort going on in Venezuela to bring about a Washington-controlled puppet in power in Caracas. Here's another interesting achievement. So this People's Dispatch mentions, just so that we can make clear that she has nothing to do with democracy. Machado was also one of the political architects of the La Salida, the departure. The 2014 opposition campaign that called for escalated protests, including guerrilla tactics. Those weren't peaceful protests, as the foreign press claimed. They were organized barricades meant to paralyze the country and force the government's fall. Streets were blocked with burned trash and barbed wire. Buses carrying workers were torched, and people suspected of being Chavista were beaten or killed. Even ambulances and doctors were attacked. Some Cuban medical brigades were nearly burned alive. Public buildings, food trucks, and schools were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were held hostage by fear, while opposition leaders like Machado cheered from the sidelines and called it resistance. So basically, this Machado has nothing to do with democracy, and she's not working for the freedom of the Venezuela people. She's actually working to free them of their natural resources and bring in Western-controlled puppets that will manage all the Venezuela oil industry and then hand out juicy contracts to U.S. and foreign corporations. So anyway, that is my report on the Nobel Peace Prize, and I'm sorry for Donald Trump if I said that a goldfish would be a better candidate for him, because the Nobel Peace Prize Committee outdid me and pointed out that a puppet is a better candidate for the Peace Prize than Donald Trump. So hooray to the puppets. Congratulations to the puppet Venezuelan Maria Corina Machado for winning the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. And with that, my report is concluded. Thank you for joining me. I'll leave everything down below that I am quoting in this report, and you're welcome to check that out and read for yourself. So have a good day. Bye-bye.